Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On the 26th of July 2008, within the span of 70 minutes, 22 bombs went off at various places in the city of Ahmedabad, inside hospitals, in buses, on parked bicycles, and in cars. A total of 56 people were killed in this attack, and around 200 were injured. This incident, which happened more than 13 years ago, has been in the news again. And this is because a special court recently convicted 49 people in the matter. And on Friday, it handed the death sentence to 38 of those who were convicted. This verdict was unprecedented because so many people have never been awarded the death sentence in a single case. In this episode, we take a look at the case and the arguments that the court looked at to arrive at this verdict. But before we do that, we speak to Indian Express's Parimal Dabhi, who back in 2008 was in Ahmedabad and had been reporting on the blasts. Parimal, this incident had really shook Ahmedabad back then. Do you remember where you were when it happened?
Yeah, actually it was July 26th, 2008, and it was a Saturday. So as I was doing the crime beat, but it was my weekly off that day. So I was out with my family on a personal visit. But while we were on the way, I got the first call from a source informing me about a blast at Raipur Khadia area in the old city. However, as I started my way forward, I started getting a lot of calls within 15 minutes. And I realized that this is not a solitary incident of a blast somewhere, and that it's a development of serial blasts in the city.
And do you recall how the mood of the city was after the blast took place?
Yeah, actually it was a Saturday. It was like any other Saturday people were witnessing. But as this news of serial blasts spread across the city, the entire situation, the mood of the city had changed completely. The roads had suddenly gone deserted, and because of this blast, the mobile network had jammed, and it was difficult to establish contact with people through mobile phones. In fact, when I was there at the Raipur site, I sent my first inputs for the story to my office through a landline phone of an acquaintance living in the Raipur area.
And Parimal, you had reported on the blast back then and visited the blast sites. What comes to mind about that? What do you remember?
Yeah, a lot of things I remember. I quite vividly remember the blast that happened at the LG hospital. Basically, there were two blasts that happened at the government hospitals. One was the LG hospital, and the other is the Ahmedabad Civil Hospital, which is the largest hospital of probably Asia. So I had gone to the LG hospital, and I can still remember the blast site there. The blast had completely blown away the parking roof there of the hospital. So that picture is quite fresh in my mind. And I still remember the deserted roads. The then Chief Minister Narendra Modi had rushed to the Ahmedabad Police Commissioner's office then, and he had held a meeting with the top officials there. So, the distance from LG hospital to Ahmedabad, the police commissioner's office it's a very a lot of traffic is there on that road. But on that day, that particular day, probably I could reach the commissioner's office within 7-10 minutes. So that was the kind of, the roads were so deserted after as an impact of these blasts. And we had reported the entire night. And then on the next morning, we were again back on duty.
And apart from the victims and their families and acquaintances, do you think the blast changed the city in any way or the way people think?
So one thing is there in people's mind that anything can happen anywhere. The kind of blast that happened in public hospitals, those memories are still fresh in people's mind. Those people who had gone to help the injured, in fact, they themselves became victims in this case. So yeah, the scars of this blast will stay in the minds of the people for long. But otherwise, the people have moved on.
Now, unfortunately, Ahmedabad was not alone in witnessing such bombings that year. Before that, two other major blasts had taken place in Jaipur and Bangalore. And even after the Ahmedabad blasts, just a day after, in fact, live bombs were found in Surat. We now speak to Indian Express's Sohini Ghosh, who has been reporting on the Ahmedabad blast verdict, about what they found in Surat and the details of the entire case.
So on July 27, that is the next day after the Ahmedabad blast, similar bombs were found in Surat, the first of them being spotted by a Safai Karamchari or a sweeper by the corporation who took the contraption home thinking it was a radio. Obviously, this is something that the investigating officers told us. And overall, in all, some 29 live bombs were found from Surat up to August 9. From July 27, that is, but none of them had gone off. And one of the reasons that was attributed for these bombs not going off as per FSL conducted was that the batteries were of low voltage.
Okay, so you have the serial blasts that happen in Ahmedabad, 22 bombs go off, and then in Surat, 29 live bombs were found, but they don't go off because, like you mentioned, their batteries were of low voltage. So who was considered responsible for these blasts?
So technically, for some time or at least immediately after the blasts, the police themselves admitted that they were quite clueless as to what is the larger conspiracy at work or larger motive at work, number one. Number two, it was also unknown who is doing this. But in the case of Ahmedabad blasts, just minutes before the bombs went off, there were emails sent to multiple media houses, a lot of them broadcast media houses, wherein a alleged organization called Indian Mujahideen, they claimed responsibility for the Ahmedabad blast as well as the previous serial bombings in Jaipur and Bangalore. So until then, Indian Mujahideen was not a known organization per se, and subsequent investigation found that Indian Mujahideen was an offshoot of SIMI. So SIMI, Students Islamic Movement, the organization was banned in 2001, basically declared as a terrorist organization. And when we go through the verdict as well as the case papers with respect to 2008 blast, the broader narrative that comes out is that because SIMI became outlawed, they created this new organization to carry on with the same activities that SIMI did.
Right, and you mentioned that the Indian Mujahideen had taken responsibility for the blast that happened earlier in Jaipur and in Bangalore. And just for the benefit of our listeners, I just want to mention that yes, during that year, just before the Ahmedabad blast, there were blasts in Jaipur, 9 synchronized bomb blasts that killed 63 people and injured more than 200. And just a day before the Ahmedabad blast, bombs had exploded in Bangalore that killed 1 person and injured around 20. And later that year also, there were attacks in Delhi, Agartala, Assam. But Sohini, do we know whether these blasts were also connected with the Indian Mujahideen?
So a lot of the blasts that took place across the country, there were claims about Indian Mujahideen being behind it. But the claim was largely backed by so-called emails that were sent by this group of people who claimed responsibility over the blast. But here I would also like to note that in 2008, there were also blasts in Malegaon and Modasa, which were purportedly connected to Hindutva fringe groups or Hindutva terror groups. So those links again were separate from some of the other blasts, say Jaipur, Bangalore, Delhi, Ahmedabad.
Okay, so these blasts happen in Ahmedabad, bombs are found in Surat, and we know through this email basically that the Indian Mujahideen takes responsibility for it. What does the police do after that, and what do they find out in their investigation?
So, as per the investigation trail, one aspect that was considered by the police as Indian Mujahideen being a legitimate organization or being an organization that needs to be taken seriously was the fact that these emails also apparently had embedded images from Gujarat riots. So this in turn was used by the investigating officers to establish this claim that these attacks were in fact a particular group avenging the injustice or the destruction faced by this particular group with respect to Babri Masjid demolition in 1992 and the 2002 riots.
So this is because the email had photographs connected to the Gujarat riots of 2002.
Correct. So the claim basically was that since a lot of property and lives of Muslims were lost in these two incidents, these attacks are them retaliating to the said injustice. This is one claim or one motive that was ascribed by the police or the investigating authorities for the said accused. That was one aspect. So in all, with respect to the Ahmedabad and Surat blast, in the case of Surat, it's not really blast, but rather plantation of bombs. A total of 35 cases were registered and arrests continued up to 2017. So that would be 9 years after the incident. And these accused who were arrested hailed from places across India, and we can't even say there were majority of the accused being Gujarat natives, but really they hailed right from Kerala, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Bihar, West Bengal, Delhi. So it was very widespread. Now the police also, because there was technology involved and a terror attack involved, there were charges of under UAPA, IPC, IT Act, Arms Act, Explosive Substance Act. All these were slapped during the investigation. And it is also noteworthy that one of the key investigating officers in this case was Ashish Bhatia, an IPS officer who is now the DGP of Gujarat. So as per the Ahmedabad police, or rather DGP Ashish Bhatia, the case was cracked before August 15th, although the arrest actually started happening after August 15th.
Okay, so like DGP Bhatia mentioned that they cracked the case that year itself, though the arrests kept happening till 2017. Now, as people are being arrested, as they're being lodged into jails, and this started back in 2008 itself, what is their time in prison like, and what developments do we see over the years?
So even before I touch upon their time spent in jail, I would also like to mention here that a lot of these accused, they remained in police custody for some 6 months, 8 months, which is quite unusual. Police custody is usually for some days, but here, because there were some 35 FIRs, the police worked in such a way where they would seek custody of the said accused for one FIR, then when that would be completed, they would seek their police remand in the second FIR, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these accused, they stayed in police custody for 6 to 8 months, during which period there are allegations of torture, human right violation, coercion, getting them to make confessional statements under some sort of threat or violence, etc. This is number one. Number two, when I come to the part about their time spent in jail, a lot of them have spent time for almost 13 years, or some of them even more. And a lot of these accused used this time in jail to get education degrees. So one of the accused, his profile is very interesting actually. It's Savdar Nagori. He has been sentenced to death now, but he also got certificate courses and diploma degrees in Gandhian philosophy, Ambedkar philosophy. And one of the aspects that was also argued by his lawyer at the time of quantum of sentence that must be given by the court, this was presented as a mitigating factor. So one of the argument that was forwarded was that if he is given a chance to be out in the society, he'll actually go out and implement the Gandhian philosophy, the Ambedkarite philosophy out in the society, and thus he is not a threat to the society.
And he adopted and studied these philosophies while being in jail?
Correct. And he was also a topper for a lot of these courses. So these guys got courses done through IGNOU, other open universities as well. And in a lot of these courses, Nagori actually topped and was also a gold medalist. So there are some 12, 14 certificate and diploma courses that he got done during this entire period.
Wow. Okay, so in that sense, he certainly stands out among those who have been convicted. But talking about their time in jail, and this is something you mentioned in your report as well, is that in February 2013, some of them tried to escape, right?
Correct. They had apparently dug up a 213 feet tunnel, and when they were caught doing this, the jail authorities themselves were quite flummoxed because they did not know how this happened under their very nose. And a separate case has been registered for that, which is before the magistrate court charge sheet has been filed. But it is also important to note that this kind of behavior or these kind of charges and allegations, these were taken into account by the special court during their conviction. So these aspects did weigh negatively and against the accused. Also, there are a lot of cases of misdemeanors during their jail stay. So there are cases of rioting, there are cases of going on a hunger strike while in jail. There are cases of them allegedly misbehaving with doctors and other jail staff.
And all these people, of course, pleaded their innocence during the case. There was, however, one person who you write eventually acted as a witness for the prosecution. And in the final verdict, which was delivered on Friday, he was acquitted. But talking about this verdict, it was very unprecedented. Out of the 49 who got convicted, 38 got the death penalty, and the remaining 11 were awarded life imprisonment. What were the arguments that were presented in the court during the case?
So broadly, the charge that the prosecution tried to establish was this was a very much pre-planned conspiracy, planned months ahead of time with a very specific purpose of avenging Muslims' death, as well as to send out a message because they carried forward Simi's objective, which was apparently to establish Islamic rule in India. And according to the prosecution, Indian Mujahideen also worked on the similar objective. This was also made part of the motive that these attacks, of course, they were avenging the 92 Babri Masjid demolition and the 2002 Godhra riots, but also to target political leaders so as to send out a message to the public at large. This is how the prosecution presented its case overall.
Okay, so you mentioned that one of the things that the prosecution is saying is that the accused were trying to target elected leaders. This included Narendra Modi, who was the chief minister of the state at the time. Then the prosecution mentioned leaders like Amit Shah, Anandiben Patel, and Nitin Patel. But what proof did they provide for this specific accusation that these blasts were done to target these leaders?
So that's the interesting part. There's no actual evidence being provided to support this claim. What was done was at the time of framing of charges, this was given as the motive. And to show a logical flow of events, the prosecution asserted that what the accused had planned was in 45 minutes, they would be setting off bombs in various parts of the city, which are Hindu dominated. Very specifically, and there are two nearest hospitals to these areas, which is Ahmedabad Civil Hospital and AMC run LG Hospital. So the next phase of the plan of the accused, as per the prosecution's case, was once people are hurt in the 45-minute span, they would be rushing to the hospitals, as would their relatives, as would political leaders, because obviously it's a blast and it's a mammoth event. And it is at that moment when bombs would go off in hospitals, also thus endangering, killing, or injuring the political leaders. That is how the broad charge was established as.
Okay, so this is what the prosecution is saying. What are the arguments of the defense?
Defense has repeatedly emphasized that, first of all, the evidence is circumstantial. Secondly, another aspect that the defense has emphasized on multiple times is the fact that a lot of the assertions being made are where a witness says at one point of time that I had seen this guy, at a second point of time he says he did not see that guy. So it becomes very dicey. There is no concrete forensic evidence that's tying all of them together.
And in the final verdict, of course, the court accepts, many arguments of the prosecution. And like we mentioned earlier, 38 of these convicts get the death penalty. What motive did the court eventually assign to those who were convicted?
The court ultimately accepted the prosecution's argument. So one of the interesting aspects was about the accused's conviction under IPC section 121A, which is basically waging a war against the state. So, for example, to justify that section, the court heavily relied on the prosecution's argument, because the defense basically argued that this cannot be called as a war against the state because they were not attacking the government. The intention was never to attack any government or any political leaders. But by constructing this sequence of events where the prosecution basically portrayed that there would be 45 minutes of blasts and then those people would be streaming into hospitals and over there you would be attacking the political leaders. That is an argument that court very readily accepted and relied on, mentioning now Prime Minister Narendra Modi's name by at least 5 to 6 times of his own volition. That's part of the order. So yes, that was basically the ground. There was no documentary evidence per se.
And one of the things that you also mentioned in your report is that investigators seem to have failed to tie up loose ends in the blast case. Could you give us some examples of that?
So, among the 49 who were convicted, in their case, the investigators, for example, they did admit that they did not actually investigate the links with other terror blasts. So, that becomes essential to actually strengthen your point of a criminal conspiracy. And also, if these attacks were indeed interconnected attacks, then it also becomes easier to establish the other cases. So that is one aspect where they failed. Now, when I, for example, come to the 8 persons who were acquitted, in their case, the prosecution failed to provide even a single piece of evidence, at least in the case of 12 of them. So you have absolutely no evidence, no oral, no written document, no testimonies supporting. So you have 12 people languishing in jail with absolutely nothing. There are parts in the verdict where it states that, for example, in the case of one of the person who was acquitted, there was a page written in Urdu that was recovered from his home, and at the time of getting the Panchnama done, it was alleged that it had information or instruction on how to make a bomb. But ultimately, when they got that Urdu page translated to Gujarati, it was clarified it did not have any such instructions. So based on just one piece of paper, you picked up someone and kept them in jail for, a decade or so. Then there are instances where a witness is saying that I saw a bearded man taking a gas cylinder from my neighbor. And based on that, it was linked to the terror attack and the guy was arrested. He was eventually acquitted by the court because the court said this was in relation to the Surat bomb plantation part of the case. So the court eventually said that, first of all, there was no gas cylinder involved in the blasts or in the bomb plantation that was done in Surat. So these are the kind of loose ends that were left by the investigators open, completely open to be torn apart, which is what eventually happened.
Okay, so then for how many people did the court find that the evidence was not sufficient?
So in the case of the total 28 acquitted, for 12 of them, the court basically observed there was insufficient evidence. And for 16 of them, the court basically observed there was absolutely no evidence. Other evidence that was relied on among those acquitted were things such as someone who had a cutting of articles about Osama bin Laden underneath his bed. This was used as evidence to arrest someone. Then there was someone who gave 2 jihadi CDs apparently to a batchmate of his, eventually asked her to destroy it. And only based on that, he was slapped with charges under UAPA Arms Act. You don't have arms. How are you slapping such charges? So that is again one loophole that was kept open by the investigating authorities.
Okay, and now talking about the unprecedented verdict of giving the death penalty to 38 people. I mean, the last time we saw so many people getting the death sentence was for the assassination of the former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. In that case, 26 people were given the death penalty. So what sort of reasoning did the court look at to give this verdict?
So one reasoning that the court mentioned about in its part about how and why it is sentencing 38 people to death was the part that there were 56 persons who were killed, and it was not just humans who were killed, but also birds and animals and dumb animals like dogs, cows, and ox. I specifically remember this. And he also mentioned this aspect about how serious a crime waging war against the state is, because you're trying to topple a constitutionally and democratically elected government. So that's a serious offense. And based on that, again, he reasoned his quantum of punishment. Another aspect that the court also relied on was the part about the unrepentant attitude of those convicted, where some of them gave a statement that we don't believe in the system, we don't believe in the justice system, we only believe in Allah and only He can provide justice. So these kind of things also weighed during the sentencing. The court also observed the fact that if people who have been accused and the charges have been substantially proven because they have now been convicted, if such people are let loose onto the society, they are like a man-eating leopard. And a man-eating leopard does not differentiate between class, caste, creed, gender of its victims. So similarly, such a person, if let loose, would repeat such offenses, would violate the peace and the system within the society, and obviously put everyone into grave threat. Secondly, another thing that the court also mentioned about was the fact that such people, their shadows too should not exist.
As in, even their physical shadow should not exist in the world.
So basically, they should not be existing in their physical form, but they should not also be existing in their shadow form. So that is again something that the court said. The court also mentioned about their jail misdemeanors and how they have behaved in the past. And the court refused to accept the argument by the defense that they had actually spent their time in jail fruitfully, where they gathered education, they tried to reform themselves. And the judge also mentioned the part about how these convicts are beyond reform and there's no hope of their reform under any circumstances.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.